our final event of the Discover Islam fortnight series. Apologies again for the technical issues. Today's talk is titled Islam, Upholding the Deen and Reorienting Ourselves, and will be delivered by Ustad Mobeen Vaid. The Ustad is a Muslim public intellectual and writer. He holds a master's degree in Islamic studies from Hartford Seminary and is a regular contributor to MuslimMatters.org, an online magazine which brings attention to issues faced by Muslims with an emphasis on those in the West. His writings center on how traditional Islamic norms and frames of thinking intersect with the modern world. The Ustad also speaks at conferences, serves as an advisor to Muslim university students, and was campus minister for the Muslim community at George Mason University. There'll be a chance to ask the Ustad questions at the end, so please do send them in via the chat inshallah, and I'll pass over to the Ustad. Barakallahu feekum.
Inshallah. Bismillah. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes?
Yep, loud and clear, Ustad.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. To begin, I just want to thank the Sussex Islamic Society for the generous invitation. Before I begin, I should offer a disclaimer that I've actually never been to the UK. I have a vague idea, as I was mentioning to the brother, about the UK and the community there. And my remarks today may therefore appear culturally distant or imprecise. If so, you can chalk it up to my Americanness. Ala kulli hal, we'll go ahead and begin. I have been tasked today with speaking to the question of threats in the modern world to our faith. What is it that produces crises of faith, and how can we effectively guard against them? To begin, it is important that we acknowledge what the data is telling us about the loss of faith. A few days ago, Gallup released its annual report on church membership. The report has been conducted annually for the past 80 years, and this year's report was striking on many counts. Perhaps most significant for us is that it showed church membership in the United States has now dropped below 50%. It is at 47%, to be precise. Although that number is striking as a marker of decline, what makes it even more significant is that only 20 years ago, so in the year 2000, that number was 70%. And to give you a point of reference, in the year 1955, that number was 73%. So over the course of 50 years, the number dropped about 3%. And now in the last 20, it has dropped over 20%. In recent years, it is in virtual freefall. The fastest growing religious group in the United States is the religiously unaffiliated. Today, nearly 25% of Americans are atheist, agnostic, or simply nothing. There are a number of articles that have been written on the rise of the nuns, as they refer them to. And it's not referring to nuns as in Christian nuns. It's referring to the people who have no religious affiliation to speak of. These numbers are even worse in the UK. A recent BSA survey found that 52% of the public say they do not belong to any religion. Only 30% of individuals polled in the UK identified as Christian. And what is stark in the UK study is the high rate of atheism, as 1 in 4 people studied explicitly stated that they do not believe in God, and they confirmed the statement, or they affirmed the statement, that there is no God. Non-believers in the US seem to be a bit more circumspect when asked that question outright about their own views on the matter. And these trends are not simply a Western phenomenon. They are now global. The Muslim world today is beset in a great cultural, social, political, intellectual, and religious battle taking place on the ground. Religion is increasingly being made the bad guy, the boogeyman of sorts, that is implicated for myriad social failures. We are backwards because of Islam, is now commonly encountered sentiment in elite quarters of Muslim society. And if you've been to the Muslim countries and been around elite quarters, it's not uncommon to run into that type of sentiment. In recent years, studies reported rising rates of unbelief and atheism in places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and more. Although we should take some of these studies with a grain of salt, it is impossible to spend time in any of these lands for an extensive period of time and not encounter cultural agitations which are rupturing past norms, especially and particularly religious ones. So the question of faith is an especially important one today, and how we uphold our own is something we need to be concerned with. Now, for my thoughts today, I've attempted to limit myself to a few intellectual currents and trends that I've observed and see as rising locations of conflict for Muslims living in the West. These thoughts are provisional and still developing, but I see them as obstacles we will have to learn to overcome if we are to mitigate the loss of faith currently engulfing Western society. The first of these trends has to do with what I'm going to term our cultural pedagogy. Now, pedagogy is a fancy, or maybe not so fancy, word that refers to the method and practice of teaching. And when I say cultural pedagogy, what I'm referring to is the method by which our culture today teaches us to apprehend knowledge. This method, I submit, is one that is anchored increasingly in detachment, distance, and above all, skepticism. This pedagogy is on display when we begin to talk about anything of meaning. Often, our impulse is to treat meaningful questions with great care and concern. We are taught that inflaming our passions is a bad thing, and that the wise are those who discern between competing views without being hasty. They are cool, calm, and collected. They aren't shaken easily, and their distance from the subject of their investigation is praised as a marker of their maturity. Everything is kept at arm's length. The modern intellectual in our collegiate settings is often a paragon of this non-confessionalism. They speak as people who analyze, examine, and deconstruct. Academics are keen to term things as reductive and problematic. On a side note, this is one of my great frustrations with modern academic culture, in that it allows fad catchphrases to do its intellectual work for it. These words like reductive and problematic are often invoked in lieu of real arguments as to why something is reductive or problematic. And even if it is so, how does that make it wrong? In any event, the point I'm making here is that our intellectual culture in society draws us out to a place where we are always living at a distance from things of consequence, which is why our academic, social, political, and other culture says so little of consequence today. In this setting, our beliefs are always on trial. We don't get very far because we are always attending to doubts. And we often manufacture and seek out doubts, even when they are thin or non-existent. We make a plaything of shubuhat, or doubting faith. And this game of make-believe has the real-world consequence of trivializing and attenuating belief. When I reduce belief to a study without significance, I forget the stakes of the questions. We also end up having trouble with affirmations. We are always deconstructing, examining, analyzing, always looking to hedge or condition, qualify, stipulate, and review. This can incapacitate us. Large truths in this environment are always in flux, so only the small truths get affirmed. The existential significance of faith and belief is lost in all of this, and our capacity to live with piety and submission weakened. Islam is a religion that necessitates and is predicated upon submission, the act of Islam. And although we are commanded to use our minds as faculties of reason that can enable us to appreciate the beauty of God's world and affirm His magnanimity, omniscience, mercy, power, and might, we are also taught that a corrupted intellect can collapse upon itself. Iblis, after all, refused to bow to Adam as a function of his own reasoning, one that he presumed to be superior to Allah's command. Ana khayrun min, he said, I am better than him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises the companions for their ability to hear and obey the message. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to this. And he says, in a verse I'll mention briefly here, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ وَمَن يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا. It is not for a believing man or woman, when Allah and His Messenger decree a matter, to have any other choice in that matter. Indeed, whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger has clearly gone astray. In a hadith narrated from Abdullah ibn Amr, and this hadith is related in the Arba'in of Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يكون هواه تبعا لما جئت به. None of you is a believer till his desires follows what I have brought. The life of piety requires us to live with modesty and humility. It demands of us that we place our foreheads on the ground repeatedly and purposefully. It reminds us that salvation hangs in the balance. It provides for us a guide, the Prophet ﷺ, whose guidance we follow and observe as we can in our lives. A life ridden with presumed epistemic skepticism and epistemology of doubt cannot fortify faith, nor can it build the spiritual strength needed to overcome the cultural agitations of our moment. And this is something we should be especially on guard over. So that is the first trend that I wanted to highlight and speak to. The second problem I'm going to highlight is the inverse of this problem, which is a pedagogy of conformity. This, to me, is often a complement to the first, or perhaps a handmaiden to it, if you will. The cultural pedagogy of doubt teaches us to sublimate our passions, to view things like religion as peculiar and interesting subjects of study, but not something we should ever sit within or feel terribly motivated by. The cultural pedagogy of conformity, however, often supplants where our passions ought to lie with a new set of passions, views, and beliefs. And there's a great irony here in how the modern world has come to function. It rejects and avoids hard discussions of truth and morality, yet crafts and encourages a citizenry that is fiercely moral on questions it deems important for all good people to care about. It does this by convincing people that they are behaving freely, individualistically, and transcendentally. They are acting on the right side of history when they follow the prevailing fashions of our age. So you get throngs of young people waxing poetic about their agency and about how they are living in modes of resistance without ever thinking past the latest viral hashtag or what their favorite cultural actor said. Technology recapitulates this problem. It creates echo chambers and in-groups. We can go months without reading views out, are never confronted with differing views and opinions, and our transgressive, quote unquote, modes of being are typically nothing more than what already exists as part of the status quo. And I should say that this is especially so with many forms of sexual reform. Quickly, far too many people convert to this new cultural religion, at least functionally. They speak a particular dialectic and rhetoric. Their morals are crafted by a reasoning that is alien to a life of faith and the existential questions of salvation. What happens to us after we die? And what is the reason for which we were created? Become secondary, if not altogether insignificant. They aren't meditated upon very often. What matters now is whether we are on the front lines of the latest justice cause, whether we're crafting the right persona of ourselves online, the right hashtagging, article sharing, etc. Whether we are sufficiently inclusive, quote unquote, pluralistic, non-judgmental, and whether we're participating as good foot soldiers for agendas and movements that have little relationship to a truly moral life, let alone revelation. This blind obedience to academic fads, cool politicians, online influencers, and social media trends destabilizes us. We habituate ourselves to seeking out approval from others, and we are often living for that approval. We are motivated by crowd support and the feeling of moral superiority that crowd support can provide. We become fragile and are susceptible to becoming jaded, cynical, and pessimistic over time. We need to be critical and resist that which tries to make us conform to a disordered social setting without losing our capacity to submit and obey. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran reminds us of those on the Day of Judgment who followed others and will look to blame those others when the time comes. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إذ تبرأ الذين اتبعوا من الذين اتبعوا ورأوا العذاب وتقطعت بهم الأسباب. Where he says, when those who have been followed disown their followers, when they see all the suffering, and when all bonds between them are suffered. وقال الذين اتبعوا لو أن لنا كرة فنتبرأ منهم كما تبرأوا منا كذلك يريهم الله أعمالهم حسرات عليهم وما هم بخارجين من النار. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the followers will say, if only we had another opportunity, we would disown them as they now disown us. In this way, God will make them see their deeds as a source of bitter regret. They shall not leave the fire. Like the kalima, La ilaha illallah, we need both negation, La ilaha, and affirmation, illallah. There is nothing worthy of worship except Allah. Finally, we need what I will simply say is a life of Islam. The greatest of intellectual doubts can often be overcome by acts of piety and by simply living as Muslims. How many are those whose fasting and prayers shielded them from doubts, and others who are saved from a single prayer or fast? Ramadan itself is a life-changing experience for Muslims around the world. It reminds us of what matters, and it reminds us the importance of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our days. The daily acts of prayer, dua, and dhikr are things that help mediate our existence and give us an ongoing communication with Allah. Our qibla is always facing Him and asking of Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes this life in the Quran. قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Say, surely my prayer, my worship, my life, and my death are all for Allah, Lord of all worlds. لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. He has no partner, so I am commanded, that this is what I am commanded, and I am the first to submit. These are the provisional and the brief remarks I had prepared for today's session. Perhaps afterwards we can have a bit of a discussion, Q&A for those who want to speak about them or want me to elaborate on them. And my thinking was perhaps from this point forward we could have that discussion, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So I don't know how you want to open up the floor or how you've done Q&A previously, but I'm open at this moment.
Barakallahu feek for the talk today, Ustad. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us. It was incredibly insightful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala greatly reward you. And inshallah, there are many lessons for us to take from.
Wafiq, not a problem at all.
Q&A now.
Yes.
Alhamdulillah. One question is, how can we use Islam as a framework to protect ourselves from other rationalities and frameworks?
Well, part of it is at least apprehending or being aware of those other frameworks. Today it is increasingly important for us to be aware of the types of social currents, intellectual currents that have come to define the societies that we're a part of. This means being aware of, history, as well as the major players that have contributed to that history. Who are the people who have contributed to the formation of the Western canon? And how has their thought been consecrated into Western society and inscribed and instantiated in our legal, social, political, and cultural order? So being aware of that is important. Understanding what has set the stage for that is important as well. So when we talk about things like, the Enlightenment project, Reformation, both scientific Reformation and religious Reformation, understanding how these things have come to set the foundation or the fulcrum of modern society, the sexual revolution, sexual reform. We have to in some ways be in touch with society and what is taking place. And we have to have the wherewithal to juxtapose that against our own commitments and beliefs. And this takes time. It's not an easy thing to apprehend. It takes some degree of education. But if nothing else, I think even absent that type of literacy, if you will, I think a Muslim can be well protected if they are simply in constant and ongoing communication with their own faith. A Muslim who fasts and prays, who attends the masjid, who is learning his deen or her deen, will be much better off and will naturally be averse to those cultural and social trends around them. Religious Muslims tend to find themselves as poor material for the modern society. They are people who are intensely committed to family, and they disagree and diverge from the growing pieties of our age. And so I think if nothing else, simply committing ourselves in that fashion is something that can help us quite a bit. If a person wants to become more discerning to the major cultural trends, then they can go out and seek that information. I understand that you have people in the UK who teach courses like this. There are a couple who I know offhand. There's the brother Ustad Abdullah, right, Al-Andalusi, who I believe has taught courses like that and is quite adept at many of these subjects. You have another brother who goes by the moniker, the Thinking Muslim, I believe, who teaches classes like this. There's also a YouTube lecture that was done relatively recently as part of Masjid Dar es-Salam. This was at the end of December. They had a conference, a winter intensive, and one of the sessions was on the modern paradigm or the modern worldview by Dr. Sharif At-Tubqi, EL-TOBGUI. If you just search that lecture or search his name in YouTube, inshallah, you should be able to find it. So there are some good materials out there that I think can help people gain some foundational knowledge on that. There are also some books you can read that I think are quite good. You have Stephen Smith's Disenchantment of Secular Discourse. I tend to recommend that book a lot. I think it's quite accessible and helps unpackage and unravel some of those secular threads. You also have other books, which I think are useful reads. Richard Tarnas has The Passion of the Western Mind, which I think is a good book for people to be acquainted with and familiar with. There's a lot of material these days on that is critiquing the sexual revolution, and is writing about the importance of the family. Relatively recent work by Mary Eberstadt on the family called Primal Screams, which I think is a very good book. I tend to recommend that one quite often. There are others as well. And if you're interested, inshallah, I can certainly give you those references. In fact, even in this Q&A if you want. But I would start off with those. Oh, Neil Postman, as always, amusing ourselves to death. I think some of these books are just, there's so many of them that, just starting there, you can get a decent foundation on various aspects of the modern world and begin to start seeing things a bit differently when it comes to a large range of issues. And Allah knows best.
Our second question is, do you think that people who claim to not follow a religion or worship a deity actually worship themselves?
Well, they definitely worship something. Question is, what do they worship? They may worship themselves. They may worship status or prestige, or worship, the culture that surrounds them. They could worship wealth. They become slaves of something in life, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, right, about those. Afaraita, right? Have you seen those who have done what? Ittakhadha ilahahu hawa, right? Those who have taken their desires as lords and gods, right? As deities. And so we see that around us. And certainly the individualistic project of the West increasingly cultivates and encourages that type of living. The type of living where a person is presumably unencumbered. He has no greater moral duties, no responsibilities that he's living for. He's independent. And this type of independence is increasingly valorized and praised. The popular media products of our age, popular movies and TV shows and things like that, increasingly surround a plot of an individual who has no social responsibilities. He is lionized, or she is lionized, as an independent hero. They are maverick. They do what they want. They live how they want. Their responsibility is purely based on what motivates them, and they can act out however they want. So you'll see an entire genre of movies that has emerged in the past few decades about the buffoon man or the buffoon woman. And they get drunk, they go out and they party all the time. They're unmarried, right? They just sort of go out. And if they're married, they just hate their marriage and they need a break, right? Those sort of movies that'll show, they go in, a guy goes for a weekend with a bunch of friends and just parties and gets drunk and tries to sleep around and all of that. But it doesn't just stop there. Even you think about the superhero movies, right? In the past 20 or so years, the emergence of the superhero movie for adults has become extremely, extremely popular. Perhaps the most popular movies now these days are movies that surround superheroes, and TV shows as well, right? People have special powers. These aren't people that have families and children, right? That's too pedestrian for the plots. And, they're constantly independent. Right? These things have a way of teaching us or communicating to us messages along those lines. And so, when you talk about that degree of individualism and what it's producing, it is producing people who become slaves of quite a bit. They are ibad, right? They are true slaves in that word. Question is, what are they slaves to? And, in my view, a person can't live a life without having deeper beliefs. A person has to believe in something, right? And so these alternative false gods and idols are filling that void for them. And Allah knows best.
Our next question is, you've touched on it a bit slightly actually, but someone asked if you have any more book recommendations on this topic and how we can learn more about this.
Yes, there was one book. This is a decent one. Yeah. It's called The Recovery of Family Life by Scott Yunner. This is one I was taking a look at recently. There are other books as well. There's a brother, Joseph Kaminsky, who recently wrote a book, Islam, Liberalism, and Ontology. I tend to recommend that book. It's actually quite an accessible read, and it's not terribly long. It's only about 190 pages. I think this is a good read. There are a ton of other books that a person can check out. If you're interested in sort of the sexual economy and an evaluation of that, Mark Regnerus has an excellent work entitled Cheap Sex. That's a good book. Alongside that book, there are others. Daryl Paul has a good book on the emergence of the LGBT movement that is entitled From Tolerance to Acceptance. From Tolerance to Acceptance, and it tracks the developments of same-sex marriage as a movement. There are plenty of other good works out there as well. Chris Hayes has a good book, America: The Farewell Tour, which has a lot of good material in it. Although again, that's sort of based in America. I think it still has a lot of cultural commentary that's broadly applicable. He also has Empire of Illusions, which is a very good book worth checking out. With Neil Postman, The Disappearance of Childhood, as well as Technopoly, are both pretty good books. There's good material out there if you want to read about it. So those are some book recommendations I would probably consider checking out, inshallah.
Inshallah. Our next question is how do you approach this in terms of, as in spreading Islam, how do you approach this in terms of family in a way that doesn't push them away from Islam and does in fact become a source of da'wah?
So, I assume the question is how do you, at least with family, how do you deal with family members that you see as increasingly irreligious? Is that kind of where it's coming from?
I think so in a sense, how do you prevent family members, how do you prevent them from becoming alienated by trying to spread the message of Islam?
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple of things. Some people may just not like faith, right? That's just reality. But at the end of the day, you try to engage with people on good terms. You want to be charitable to them, especially your family members. You're kind to them. You have responsibilities towards them, especially your parents. Birrul walidain in Islam. It's wajib, right? It's an obligation that a person obeys their parents and is good to them to the extent possible, especially their mother. And so as Muslims, we should live that type of a life where we're good to our elders, we're good to our parents, we're kind and loving and caring to them. And over time, we make dua for them. We respond in good ways when we feel offended or we feel that they've wronged us. We try to respond in a way that's better. And over time, we hope that has an impact and a feeling. We adjust contextually and situationally based on what we think might be the best method or what is most appropriate, right? Bil hikmah, right? As Allah tells us to do da'wah with wisdom. And maw'idat al-hasana, right? And beautiful preaching, where when we do bring up faith, we bring it up in a way that we try to mitigate the possibility of offense and maximize the likelihood of it being accepted. With others as well, same thing, right? There's not a perfect da'wah track out there. All of the prophets, for instance, were rejected by their people. And these are men whose da'wah was impeccable. No one would say that the anbiya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alayhim salam had a deficient da'wah or a da'wah that was not utilizing the best and perfect method at all times. And yet, they were frequently rejected by their people. And so we have to remind ourselves that, we have a message that at times is not going to be popular, and especially in an era like ours. And everything that we're mired within, people are going to look at a lot of the teachings and beliefs in Islam and say, well, that's just backwards, right? That's primitive and archaic, or, not suitable for modern society. And, look, lakum dinukum waliya din, right? At the end of the day, it's like, okay, khalas, if you want to follow like your own submitting to yourself or your desires or whatever, that's just going to be your deen. But my responsibility as a Muslim is to continue to call you to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And perhaps you'll accept, perhaps you'll reject. But we shouldn't be apprehensive about doing so. We should continue to do it in spite of the rejection that we face. And we should ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for hidayah for ourselves, as well as making us means of guidance for others. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Ameen. Our next question is, how do we protect ourselves from other deens? I.e., how do we know if we're following something outside of Islam?
I suppose that's a good question. In some ways, I think it depends, right? I don't know that, you know, I think this question probably has less to do with, well, how do I know I'm not following Christianity or Judaism or something? I imagine a person who's literally following a religion like that would probably be aware of what they're doing. I have a tough time believing a person would just unself-consciously become or follow a totally different religion like that. I think what this is referring to perhaps is what I mentioned by way of popular religion, which is the religion of the unaffiliated. And how do we protect ourselves against submitting to their religious discourse? I think one of the things that we always have to remind ourselves of and revisit is our own commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And to do an ongoing muhasabah, right? How are we in front of Allah? We examine our own selves and our own nafs. We take account of it, right? Where's our recitation of the Quran? Where's our dhikr? Where's our dua? Where's our salah? Where's our attending of the masjid? Where's our obedience to Allah's path, right? In everything that we're doing, and to what degree are we finding ourselves distant from all of that? And if we find ourselves distant with all of that, chances are that we're also conforming in various ways to those popular religions, right? The cultural agitations and the social currents of our movement start beginning to weigh on us more and more. They can overwhelm us psychologically and emotionally if we're not careful. And so I think that a person's regular practice of their own faith can help them in a great deal in providing protection against this type of intellectual incursion. Allah knows best.
Our next question is how do we approach encouraging people to liberate themselves from frameworks which are outside of Islam?
Yeah, I mean, it takes time, obviously. It's not something, it may happen overnight, but it's not something that will happen overnight. I think that we continue giving da'wah, and a lot of times it's just reminding people of the basics, right? Returning to God, right? Returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, preparing yourself for the hereafter and standing in front of Him. Reminding people that there's more to life than just the pursuit of wealth or the increasingly ephemeral aspiration of entertainment and distraction, trying to reduce all of the noise that surrounds us, and being focused in a life that is, that deals with the bigger questions, right? Of why do I exist? Why am I here, right? We need to remind people of that, right? We need to remind people of the akhirah. We need to remind people of the path of the Prophet ﷺ. We need to remind people from the book of Allah, right? وَذَكِّرْ بِالْقُرْآنِ. Remind them with the Qur'an. And so this is just, this is basically just communicating and teaching Deen and teaching religion. I think that is our ultimate responsibility at a minimum. Not everyone's going to be sort of intellectual savant where they're critiquing and analyzing, oppositional trends or intellectual currents. There's probably, a minority of people that will do that. Some will be successful. Others themselves may be influenced along the way and end up with some sort of syncretic ideas and beliefs. I don't think that that's a responsibility that is reasonable for everyone to take on. I don't think it's our responsibility at all. Our primary responsibility is to try to adhere to Allah's path and to be people who are aware of that path, live according to it, and try to spread it to those around us. And so, and I think that's something all of us can do. I don't think that that's outside of any of our reach, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us. He has blessed us in our lives, and He has put around us and made accessible people who have knowledge of Islam and the religion who we can study with. You have masajid, you have places where you can worship. You have Muslims around you in the Muslim community, and you can be a part of. You have brothers and sisters. These are not trivial things. None of us, as far as I know of, live in a society that actively oppresses us and tries to rid us of our Islam by force or coercion, right? We're not living in camps or something like that, where our Islam is being viewed as some sort of disease. Even if sort of the soft power of society can weigh on us quite heavily, it is nonetheless something that we have the ability to overcome, and that we have various support structures that can help us overcome it. And so, we should avail ourselves of that and not take any of that lightly.
Our next question, it again relates to something you've actually mentioned. How do you understand what you are a slave to? How do you become aware of what you're submitting to?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this does relate to what we've already discussed. Again, this is just us revisiting our own faith and our own practice on an ongoing basis. Sometimes a person may be beholden to something without necessarily being a slave to it in some ways. And so a person may find themselves becoming stingy, for instance, and they become more reticent to give in charity, and they're being less generous and less giving. And when that happens, we have to ask ourselves why that is. What is it that's and we seek refuge with Allah from bukhl, right? That we seek refuge with Allah from stinginess. This is from the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, that we should be generous and charitable people. Then so we just respond to those types of things, and we have to be on guard. We have to check ourselves, right? That's all it is. And we should check, our prayer. If we find our salah being weak, right, in the sense that we're just rushing through prayer as fast as humanly possible, even when we have nothing else to do, we should ask ourselves, why is that? Why am I rushing through salah when I have nothing else to do? Right? And not saying that if I had something else to do, it would be justifiable. It wouldn't. Right? This is time I'm spending in front of my Lord, and I'm standing in front of Him and praying to Him as He's commanded me to. And if I can't do that with sort of a minimum level of tama'nina, sort of in each position where I'm settled, and sakina, and at least trying to have some khushu' and focus and concentration in this salah. And it's something that I've just stopped making an effort towards. I have to take a step back and say, what is it about me? That's causing that to happen. And the beautiful thing about all of our challenges is that they're redeemable. They're problems we can fix, right? So we're talking about problems that aren't insurmountable, right? Your prayer that's rushed, if you give it 2-3 additional minutes of time, that's it. To make it a prayer that's not rushed, to make it a prayer that is prayed properly, right? 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, we're talking about a trivial amount of time in the grand scheme of things. And yet that is the difference between a salah in which you're focused and devotional, as opposed to a salah that you're just rushing through, right? Just think about that. And you can start that at your next salah. Heck, when you're thinking about it, you just stand up, do 2 rak'ahs nafila, and focus, and, assuming it's not sort of one of the non-permitted times to pray, right? But you can do that, right? And so, these are things that we can rectify. We see that, we haven't fasted, outside of Ramadan. Okay, well, say tomorrow I'll fast. Right? That's all it is. We don't have to belabor some of these things. We just have to begin and embark down that path. And as we walk towards Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala runs towards us, as we know from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Do you have time for 2 more questions? Just that. That's how many we've got left in the Q&A.
Sure.
Okay, our second to last question is, how do you suggest we go about learning the epistemology of Islam / Deen, and what is the equivalent of epistemology in Islam?
So I think this must be predicated on what I mentioned about sort of the epistemology of doubt. The epistemology of Islam, oftentimes we have to look at sort of epistemology refers to how do we know what we know. And we have to examine that, right? What gives us knowledge in Islam? In the modern world, right, there are a few sources of knowledge, observation or empirically accessible data and information. We don't deny that. We say that, we can apprehend parts of the world empirically, obviously, and we can make various conclusions based on our observations of the world. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to observe the world, the natural world around us, and to reflect on it as a marker of his own creation, as I mentioned during the talk. But we have additional sources. That's not the only ontological resource that we can bring to bear when we're trying to understand the world. And critically, an additional resource that we have is revelation. And so the Quran and Sunnah and the tradition that emerges after that. And so understanding that we understand that there's a much, much greater notion of what exists out there, that we believe in the unseen, alim al-ghayb. We understand how active and vibrant that world is, and how much greater that world is than the material observable world, right? The empirically accessible world for us is in fact the smaller part of Allah's creation, right? There are plenty of ahadith, for instance, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he speaks about the sheer number of angels. And he said there is not the span of a hand except that there is an angel bowing, standing, or prostrating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The activeness of that world is something that the Prophet ﷺ tells us about quite often. And so, when you begin to understand all of that, you recognize the smallness of what we may consider to be quite large, right? We sort of assign largesse to the created order, right? And all the universes and all the galaxies and everything else. And we're just beginning to appreciate just how large all of this is, but we recognize even all of that, the farthest galaxies, the farthest planets and everything else that we've been able to gain some access to, pictures and this and that. That's a drop in the bucket in Allah's creation. And Allah's creation is much, much, much greater than all of that. And it's greater than anything that we'll ever be able to fully wrap our heads around. So recognizing that we have a greater sense of what's out there, what exists, and our resources that we appeal to, fundamentally anchored in this notion of revelation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed for us guidance that we follow in our lives. So that is a critical resource that we have to draw on and that we have to go back to time and again. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
Our final question is, with Ramadan upcoming, do you have any advice on how we can engage in da'wah during this month and beyond?
Yeah, I'd say, I think just as a general note, I would highly encourage people to, at a minimum, get off social media. But I would say at least spend time away from social media for the month of Ramadan. Engage more in worship, right? Especially reading the Quran, right? The month of the Quran, Ramadan is. And so we should be doing those things of worship in our days. We should be spending our days in devotion and focusing on that ongoing worship in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think that's our primary responsibility, right? It's in Ramadan. It is this month of worship. It is this month of charity. And so, although we can still keep up the da'wah work, I would think in some ways, we just return a little bit to ourselves in our worship too. And that becomes a heightened point of emphasis in this month, in the month to come rather, which should be starting here in a few days, bi'idhnillah. So that would be my general guidance, right? Limit the distractions in our life, right? The messaging apps, the this and that, the things that just take you time away, and fill up your days, right? Try to find moments where you can really spend that free time worshipping Allah, and Allah knows best.
Alhamdulillah, that concludes our Q&A and our talk. Jazakallah khair again for speaking to us today, Ustad. There are a lot of important lessons for us to take from this event. Jazakumullah khair and to everyone else for attending. Today actually concludes our Discover Islam Fortnight series. We hope people greatly benefited from this, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it from us. Stay up to date with any future ISOC announcements. You can stay up to date on our Facebook, which is just Sussex ISOC, and also our Instagram, which is sussex.isoc, or also our WhatsApp groups as well. We'll conclude there, inshallah. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.